So again, I'm from Research for Action. I'm also here with my colleague Britton Haller, and I'm going to talk about a report that we put out a couple years ago, actually, and Britton was one of the authors on that report, so I invite Britton to chime in whenever. Okay. And there are handouts going around, so you should have copies of the handouts. I also have a few copies of the full report if anyone is interested. But Research for Action is a nonprofit research and evaluation organization located here in Philadelphia. And we've been evaluating 21st century community learning centers for the last 5 years or so. 21st Century is a federal funding stream that comes through the state. The state decides how it gets awarded and what are the parameters and requirements, et cetera. And it's the second largest funding stream for out-of-school time programs in Philadelphia. So we've been working with, and all the grants that are awarded require evaluation. So we've worked with a number of organizations around the city over the last 5 years to do these evaluations. Typically we have a large number of evaluations going on at any one time. So the number we've done range from 10 to 14 providers, and then each provider might have multiple grants. They're working in multiple sites around the city. So what we've been able to do at the end of each year, after all the reporting requirements of 21C have been met, is to aggregate this data and look at what's happening in this subset of out-of-school time programs across the city in a larger way. And we did 3 rounds of reports on these programs. All of these programs are, I would say, 99% of the ones that we work with are based in schools. So this theme of partnerships that we've been talking about is an important part of these evaluations. Just to give you a really quick overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the study and how we conducted it, give you a little sense of the context in which the study was conducted. We, in this study, really highlight organizational level elements of quality programming, so we'll talk about that, and then a little bit about outcomes and recommendations at the end. And again, this report came out in 2015 actually, but it was based on data collected during the 2013-14 school year. So just as an overview of the study, you can go into the next slide. Our research questions included a look at quality. To what extent are high quality out-of-school time practices occurring, particularly at that organizational level? So in terms of what content was in the program, how did they staff the programs, what were their school partnerships like, parent and community engagement. So those are the elements of quality that we were interested in. We were also interested in who were the students that were participating and how frequently did they participate, and then how the elements of quality and participation levels were relating to student outcomes. So we know in evaluations of out-of-school time programs, quality really matters and also dosage really matters. So if there are, in some studies of example 21st century programs, they lump them all together, and sometimes the results don't look that great. And because there's varying levels of quality, there's a lot of different levels of participation, so it's important to break those things out, and that's what we tried to do in this study. So the data that we collected, and these were collected as part of all of the individual evaluations that were created for the providers, included teacher surveys, and that actually is a required element for 21st century. So there are teacher surveys, student outcomes that we were able to get through the School District of Philadelphia, and thanks to Kelsey and her office that is very responsive to us in providing that data. And then we conducted analysis that included propensity score matching, OLS or logistic regression, and my colleague who conducted that analysis is not here today, so I will do my best to answer any questions you might have, but within limits. So in terms of the qualitative work, we did interviews with principals and the staff who worked in the programs, especially the program coordinators, around implementation and staffing, et cetera. We reviewed the documents, the reports they have to submit to 21C, their program schedules, et cetera. And then we did staff surveys of the frontline staff. So we did interviews with program coordinators, but then surveyed all of the frontline staff. In this year, we had 10 organizations that we were partnered with, and they worked in 39 programs around the city. They were serving 3,800 youth. And when we looked at outcomes, we chose a comparison group from the same school, but who were not participating in 21st century programs. Okay, so moving into the organizational level elements of quality. So as I said, this is quality really matters in terms of the outcomes that we're looking at in out-of-school time programs. And we looked at the data we had collected and attempted to sort of rate the programs and rate the sites on some of these elements of quality. And so we used a framework that had been used in another study of 21st century programs, I think conducted in the state of Indiana, Iowa, Indiana, I always forget which one. But they rated programs in these 4 areas and then looked at the outcomes of these programs in relation to the level of quality they were able to identify in these areas. And they did find that programs of highest quality for youth who are participating most frequently did have positive impacts on the students that were participating. And I should say 21st century programs are really targeted towards academic outcomes. That's a big theme. So that's why academic content is important for 21st century programs. So the 4 big areas, again, are academic content, the staffing, who are the staff, school partnerships, and parent and community engagement. And other research on out-of-school time programs has also highlighted these 4 areas, which I think is why those researchers selected these areas. And we had also been using similar frameworks in the work that we'd been doing. So this model aligned really well. But we did adapt it to our context and the data that we had collected. So first I'll tell you a little bit about what we found when we assessed programs in terms of these 4 quality areas, and then we'll look at outcomes. In terms of academics, again, just to get a little more specific on the indicators, the presence and structure of homework help was one important indicator, and that it was regular and sufficient time, that was structured and targeted, and that there was enough individual support for the students. So it was done in small groups. The small, 10 to 12 is one study we found that was a benchmark, but it could be smaller. I think the more individual support, the better. And then it was also important to look at whether the program offered academic supports in other ways, so integrating academic content into other things that were being offered. It's also important to note that the literature on out-of-school time programs does not suggest that it should be all homework, especially as youth age, in middle school and high school youth. They can vote with their feet. They're not going to come to a program if it feels too much like school. So the goal is not to have a program that's all homework. And so thinking of other creative ways to integrate some of that academic content if you're trying to impact academic outcomes. So what we found in looking across the programs in our sample was that they did typically offer mandatory homework help 4 days a week. That was a common practice. But they also were all offering other things, enrichment, project-based learning. However, one of the key components was the relationship to the school day, and we didn't see programs frequently making that school day connection. So what are my students learning in their school day? What are they working on in math? For example, could I bring that somehow into the out-of-school time program? We didn't see that happening a lot in a very intentional way. We also looked at sort of the strongest programs. We took the top quartile of programs as we had scored them. And they were implementing almost 3/4 of the promising practices that we identified, but none of them were implementing everything. So, they were doing a lot, but none were doing all of those things. In terms of staffing, the 2 key dimensions here were the staff experience and credentials as well as professional development. So what their staff bringing, and then what kinds of training is being offered to them. And in particular, do staff have how many staff are reporting that they have some credits towards college degree or a college degree? And also, how long have they been working in the out-of-school time field? So is this first job for them, entry level, or have they been in this field for a while? How long have they been with their provider? Is there a lot of turnover within a provider? And then their competency in building rapport with youth. We know adult-youth relationships is a really key piece of any out-of-school time program. What is staff's reported competency? That came from the survey where they actually were kind of self-reporting. I feel like I'm good at this aspect of my job. In terms of professional development, is it offered and is it relevant to out-of-school time? How much is available for program coordinators and how much is available for staff? So there's sort of a threshold in the literature on teacher professional development. It's around 15 hours a year that is used sometimes in out-of-school time, although I don't know that there's a lot of research that says that that's necessarily the right number, but we were sort of using that as a guide because it is something that's true in education. So we looked at whether there was that level of professional development. What we found, and in the report there's a lot more detail on all of these things, I'm just kind of abbreviating here, but what we found, you can go to the next slide, was that so programs were seeking out highly qualified staff in terms of education. Most of the providers were looking for and had program coordinators that had a bachelor's degree or higher, and a large percentage of staff had some college, and or they were very experienced. So there were lots of highly qualified staff within these programs, but they were having difficulty with retention. So they might have staff, but a lot of out-of-school time jobs are part-time, they don't necessarily pay that well. Retention is a common challenge in the out-of-school time field. There was professional development being offered, but and this was a change from previous years. I think there was definitely a decrease in the number of hours of professional development that staff were receiving, and most were not receiving the 15 hours a year, kind of meeting that threshold. And then in terms of partnerships with schools, so here, some of the key dimensions that we were looking at included principal relationships and teacher relationships. And in terms of principals, it was the amount of communication they had with the program coordinator, the principal's knowledge of the out-of-school time program from the staff's perception. So this came from our staff survey. The principal's support and respect for out-of-school time for the program itself and what it could offer to the school, and their advocacy for the program. In terms of teacher relationships, the amount of communication that was occurring between teachers and program staff, the school day teachers' knowledge of out-of-school time programming, and the staff presence in the school during the school day, because that presence can help foster some of these relationships if they're there for more than just the after-school program, if they have some time in the school during the day other than that. Again, this is all from the perception of the out-of-school time staff. It comes from the staff survey. So what we found here was that a majority of program staff felt supported by their principals, but they didn't think the principals were that knowledgeable about the program. But they did feel like the principal was happy to have them, would be helpful to them when they needed it. There were less robust relationships with teachers. There were informal relationships, kind of on an as-needed basis, but there wasn't a lot of systematic or structured kind of communication that had been developed. Some providers actually do this and have some good strategies and ideas, but across the board it wasn't a common practice. But there was actually a fair number of programs that were hiring school day staff, including teachers and paraprofessional staff from the school who would then be in the after-school program, which can help with some of that communication and can help with those connections between the school day and after school. And the last bucket here is parent and community engagement, and we had less data on this, but what the dimensions we were looking at, again, were staff-parent communication and were there actually scheduled opportunities for participation, and how many partnerships did out-of-school time providers have. So we talked about how schools have their partners. Out-of-school time providers who are partnering with the schools also then bring in other partners, right? So how many partners did they have with other community agencies? And so most programs had some form of communication with parents, so that was positive, but not a lot of opportunities for volunteering and not a lot of structured programming for parents. Some providers did, but generally they were not doing those sorts of things. They were partnering with other community organizations. There were actually lots of partnerships, but they also wanted more, and they would like to develop those relationships further. So in terms of student outcomes, we did look at this in a number of ways, and I'm not going to go through all of the outcomes that we found, but I am going to show you what we found in terms of the relationship between some of these elements and the outcome of student social behavior and classroom performance, which is this teacher survey. So this is teacher survey outcomes and how what teachers were reporting in terms of the impact of these programs on their students. So we found the straight line at the bottom shows a direct relationship between the amount of academic content the program had and teachers' perceptions of student improvement and performance. And so in some ways that makes sense. Part of the academic content is, are they doing homework? Some of the questions on the survey ask, has homework completion improved? But there might be other reasons for that link as well. So we definitely saw a direct link between the amount of content in the program and teachers' perceptions of the program, right? We also saw a connection between participation levels and teachers' perceptions of improvement over the year. And so that's been documented in lots of research on out-of-school time programs. The more youth participate, the more positive, the stronger the outcomes are. But then there was an indirect link as well between program content and also staff quality and professional development and participation. So I don't think we completely understand why there is a relationship between academic content and participation. The more academic content the program had, the higher level, the higher the participation was. And we don't completely understand that relationship, except to say that parents really care about youth getting their homework done. We hear that over and over and over again from providers. And so for elementary school students, parents really decide if they're coming to that program. And those students can't leave school on their own. So that might be one way to explain the participation, that relationship. But the relationship between staff quality and professional development and participation, I think, is easier to understand in the sense that if staff are good at engaging youth, if staff, if you have a strong team, strong staff, that's what helps students connect to the program, those adult-youth relationships. So the relationship with participation there makes a lot of sense. And then those two things do impact outcomes through their impact on participation. We just had a couple of recommendations. Kind of high-level recommendations. Ensure that there is some homework support, but also provide alternatives for students who complete homework. So, I think being thoughtful about that homework period and use that time well. Continue hiring and then retaining. Focusing on retention has been a theme for all of these citywide studies that we've done. Retention always comes up as one of the biggest challenges. And on to the last slide. Continuing to develop those systems and strategies for strengthening school partnerships, especially the communication with teachers, because teachers can really inform what's happening during the school day and how the out-of-school time program can boost student grades and performance in other ways. And then, again, continuing to engage parents and community partners in strategic ways. So that is it.